So thank you and welcome to all who are watching. And thank you especially to Bishop Kevin Doran for agreeing to be interviewed. Bishop Doran is, of course, Bishop of Elphin, which for those watching from overseas, basically coincides with the rest of Ireland, County of Sligo, and certain neighbouring counties, bits and pieces of them. Wouldn't that be correct to say?
More actually of County Roscommon and North Sligo. It's territorially it's more Roscommon, but population is bigger in Sligo.
Okay, well, thank you. And of course, no, thank you. And of course, you've been a staunch advocate of the right to life basically throughout your entire priesthood, and are well known for that. And I saw last week you had a short video up about the fact that we have assisted suicide legislation currently before the Justice Committee in the Oireachtas, which is our parliament. So you had a few words to say about that, but just before kind of launching into this properly, you can, I mean, under that general heading of the right to life, we're concerned about doing our best to preserve life. And so we're doing that very much in COVID and trying to reduce the death rates. And we've gone to great lengths to do that. But it seems to be a bit of a paradox, and we see it both here and in New Zealand, where they had a referendum last year to legalise assisted suicide, passed by a majority of 2-1, like our abortion referendum. So you're going to great lengths to save people from a natural cause like COVID, while at the same time moving to pass legislation that will allow us to deliberately take the lives of the old and infirm if they ask for it. So what's your opinion about what explains that paradox, please?
Well, it's a very complex one, but a lot of it has to do with a kind of a very confused approach to political correctness. You know, the whole focus on protecting the lives of the elderly and people with underlying health conditions in the context of COVID presumes that they want to be protected. And with the assisted suicide, the assumption is that some people can, on the basis of their own sort of freedom of choice, make the decision to end their lives, and that somehow or other that has no implications beyond themselves. So it's about autonomy, and of course, everywhere you look, you know, autonomy is one of the key tenets, I suppose, if you like, of political correctness. Everybody's entitled to their own choice. But the thing about it is, where you come to something like assisted suicide, apart altogether from the fact that, you know, from a Catholic theological point of view, the decision to take one's own life flies in the face of God, who is the giver of life. Quite apart from that, it involves other people who are asked to support you in the process. Doctors and nurses whose whole purpose is the service of life and the care of their patients are being asked now to and brought into a situation where they're being put under pressure to participate actively in the taking of life. And then, of course, also, yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say the other thing is that obviously when people are once given authorization to participate in the taking of the life of another, it's very difficult then to say how do you logically draw a line under that and say that this is only for X category. And so, you know, people who are not terminally ill, people who are intellectually disabled, or people who are emotionally disturbed, or even children are being regularly terminated, if you can use that expression, in countries that have already allowed assisted suicide.
Yeah, I mean, I recall that at the time of the abortion referendum in 2018, you warned that this would be the next step. Yes. And you were accused of scaremongering. And then actually probably even quicker than we anticipated. They've now moved this thing to second stage in the door, and it looks like, we saw people like Leo Varadkar vote in favour, Justice Minister Helen McEntee, Health Minister Stephen Donnelly, very, very senior political favours were in favour of moving this to second stage. And while they have misgivings about the particular private members bill before the Justice Committee, which is from Deputy Gino Kenny, they don't seem to have any objection to the principle overall. So we've moved with lightning speed, basically, from the abortion referendum to the situation we're in now. So I think some people owe you a bit of an apology for accusing you of scaremongering.
Well, yes, I mean, it's interesting that at the time, definitely, the suggestion was made to me that I was trying to just scare little old ladies. And I said, I'm not actually trying to scare little old ladies, but I think little old ladies should be scared. Because little old ladies and little old men, and I'm getting close to being one of them myself, are certainly, next on the agenda as far as the political establishment is concerned.
But isn't it
all of this?
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, all of this goes back to, I suppose, a concept which I suppose was developed in the 1930s in the, what you might call, interwar period, the notion of a life without value. The idea that somehow or other it's possible to sort of take, the totality of the population and say, here are certain ones whose lives are without value. And the Catholic Church obviously rejects completely the notion that there is any life without value. There may be lives which are not capable of performing to the requirements of the economy or of perhaps living up to people's social expectations. But every human life is the gift of God and is created not for just the 70 or 80 years that we're here on earth, but for eternity. And there is no such thing as a life without value.
I mean, a further paradox, I guess, is, so, you're talking about how highly we value the idea of choice. Yes. And people think with assisted suicide, well, it'll just be the person's choice and it'll have no further social effects and put no pressure on anybody. And there'll be no slippery slope, all of which are being disproved by the experience of countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, which are further down this road than us. But in trying to contain COVID, people can clearly see you've got to restrain people's choices. Because if we don't restrain people's choices and freedoms, then we could have a huge outbreak that overwhelms the health system and sends the death rate intolerably high. So it's kind of funny that when it comes to COVID, they can see it as a common good argument for restricting people's freedom for a set period of time.
Yeah, it's interesting with regard to the COVID-19, when you look back at some of the policy documents that were developed both in other countries and indeed here in Ireland around the prioritization of critical care for people in a pandemic situation. On the one hand, they say that people shouldn't be discriminated against on the basis of age or general health and so on, but some of the language in those documents is utilitarian at the same time. They talk about the fact that in a COVID situation or a pandemic situation, when there's pressure on the health services, that the effort has to be made to save the maximum number of life years, and things like that. So the focus is not on recognizing, kind of John or Mary or Pat, who whose life is of unique value to them and to their family, but of saying that we have to calculate, John or Mary or Pat are 75 years of age. How many life years are they likely to have? And to some extent, there is an implication in there that we will value people and prioritize people's care, based on this utilitarian judgment of the value of their life.
In respect of how we're responding to COVID-19 and the kind of public health measures and restrictions in place, I mean, one of the things that's been brought up right along ever since they were brought in, initially last March, and here we are now nearly a year later and we're still living with them, was the idea of proportionality. Because obviously, if you take something horrible like car accidents, all right, I mean, we could reduce them to zero if we simply banned cars from the road.
Absolutely.
But we don't do that because we decided it would be a disproportionate response. And it's a very hard thing to get right here, but what is the correct proportionate response to COVID in terms of some of the freedoms they take away? So an obvious one, for example, is public worship. So we can't currently attend mass, people can't attend mosque or synagogue or temple or church except for private prayer. So other countries are still allowing this. So England, which is where apparently the UK variant broke out, which is more infectious, they're currently allowing public worship and we're not. And Ireland seems to be one of the first countries to stop public worship and one of the last countries to permit public worship again. So what's your opinion about that?
Yeah, again, I think sometimes you have to. It's like the skin of the different layers of an onion. You have to take the different layers apart. I think if you look at the period, say last March, nobody knew what this pandemic was about, and obviously it was important to be cautious and not to take unnecessary risks. In the period, say immediately after Christmas, there in January, with the very high levels of infection that were around, clearly any gathering of people in any context, posed a more serious risk than perhaps 2 months previously. So I think one of the things that as bishops say we have been very anxious to do was to reflect what I would describe as a pro-life stance in terms of taking the steps that are necessary to protect the life and health of our own parishioners and their families, and also the people with whom they've come in contact. Now, at the same time, then we the question of proportion arises. One of the things, for instance, that we brought to the attention of government last summer, when they were gradually reopening, as they say, the economy, the question of the numbers of people that could be allowed in a church, and we did actually get agreement that some churches obviously could cope with more than 50, and so we have this idea of the pod, and say in our cathedral here we have 3 pods, always taking into account the fact that nobody is within 2 meters of one another unless they're in the one household. So I suppose one of the efforts that we've been making through a process, I suppose, using what you might call diplomacy, I suppose, is to make the case, where it's self-evident to us, at least, that this is consistent with respect for life and health, that we can open and exercise the right to public worship. Now, the difficulty around that also is the whole thing of comparison. There's a risk, I suppose, you'd be inclined to say, comparing the church with the hotel industry, or comparing the church with the hairdresser, or the church with the supermarket. And so my mother used to say comparisons are odious. And in a certain sense, it's the comparisons always fall short in some shape or form. The church is a different context. And one of the things, I suppose, that we have difficulty about is the suggestion that has been made at times that public worship is not a priority. I think we can all accept the fact that that there are going to be restrictions, and probably will be for some time to come. But if the suggestion is that in the context of considering the reopening, that public worship is not a priority, then you have to ask yourself, whose judgment, whose value judgment is that?
Well, I went to one of the press conferences, the NEFIT ones. I was going a lot through part of last year, and I went to one at the end of September. And this is when Dublin had gone back into level 3,
Yes.
so had Donegal, and then the rest of the country, of course, followed a short time later. And of course, level 3 means you can go to the gym privately and on your own. You can go to the hairdresser, you can go into any shop, but you couldn't go to mass. You couldn't go to, the church except to pray. So they move, they stopped public worship very quickly here. But anyway, I asked, why are you doing this? Because we're at that point a complete outlier in Europe in doing this. And so the answer I got from Dr. Ronan Glynn, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, was, well, we're kind of shutting down things that are considered, quote unquote, less important in the context of a pandemic. So that kind of reinforces your point that they just don't see public worship as that important, even though there's a constitutional right to it. But there's no constitutional right to go to the hairdresser and to go to the gym. But we treat them as if they're on a par. And one is actually, I mean, the fact that you could go to the gym and couldn't go to mass shows that, if anything, the government is treating public worship as less important than these activities, even though it's constitutionally protected.
Yeah, I mean, I do appreciate the fact that the thing about church that is a bit different from some of these other things is that significant numbers of people gather into one space, even though it is a larger space.
There could be many people in a gym. I mean, you might be 2 meters away from you, and like in a hairdresser, there's somebody hovering directly over your head.
Yeah, I gave up going to gyms a long time ago because I reckoned life was a treadmill itself, and I didn't need another one. But in the one thing I think we would say with our hands in our heart, and I think nobody would question it, is that we demonstrated in June and again in October and again in December our capacity to operate the churches with Mass and the sacraments in a safe manner, with the sanitizing and the volunteers and the physical distance and all the signage and stuff that was required. And so I think from our point of view, the church is certainly safe, and I think one of the things we've been very anxious as bishops to do is to get the message out there that it is not dangerous to come to Mass or to receive the sacraments.
I mean, sorry to interrupt, have the bishops asked NEFID or the government for evidence, direct evidence that justifies stopping public worship? Evidence that it does add to infection levels, because it seems to be only a supposition.
Yeah, no, my understanding is that in the engagement, and normally it's the 4 archbishops who engage with government on behalf of the Episcopal Conference, but my understanding is that the government and NEFID have been quite clear that they don't see the church specifically as a place where people are unsafe, or they don't see churches as a cause of infection. But what they have been saying, obviously, is that in a time of heightened community transmission, anywhere where people gather in larger numbers, it poses a greater risk. And I accept that. I think, but the difficulty is, I think there's not the same level of recognition of the need that people have for spiritual nourishment.
But why do you think that we are almost the only country in Europe, with only a few exceptions, that have completely stopped public worship? Because obviously all of the scientific advisors and medical advisors and all of these other countries who are giving advice to governments could easily say the same thing as NEFID, but they're not saying it. So in France, you can go to Mass. In Italy, you can go to Mass. In Spain, you can go to Mass. I think in Germany, in England, you can. In Scotland and Northern Ireland, you can't. But there are also exceptions. So why do you think in Ireland, our medical advisors are so quick to close public worship by comparison with all these other major European countries?
I don't know. I mean, I'd have to be getting into their heads to understand that. I think anybody who's working in public health at the moment, or anybody who's working in government, is an extremely difficult position to be in. And I suppose one of the concerns at the moment, as I hear it, is that politicians particularly feel that they will get the blame for what happened in December, and for the very rapid rise in infections that took place in late December and in January, and that they're going to be extremely cautious about making similar decisions in the future. That's the message.
Yeah, except that, okay, so we're all in level 5 at the moment.
Yeah.
But they don't even allow public worship in level 3. Never mind
Yeah,
4.
and this is the difficulty that we have, and it's a case that I made to our own local politicians here, because I obviously keep in touch with our own elected representatives in the 2 constituencies that are in the diocese here, and the point that one of the points I would have made to them is that, you know, the living with COVID 5-stage plan is meant to be a graduated plan. But where the church is concerned, it's not graduated. We're either open or closed, and so you know, one of the concerns that I would express very strongly at the moment is the idea that that funerals have to be restricted to 10 people. This in my view is not acceptable, because, you know, an average family, especially of a middle-aged person who dies, there will be more than 10 people in the immediate family between the 3 generations, and you know, how do you say to certain members of the immediate family, you can't come? And it puts the families into a very difficult, painful place. It also puts priests under extremely difficult pressures, and you know, that's something I would be asking for an immediate relaxation of, you know, back to at least the 25 people that were permitted before.
Yeah.
Which in any church is perfectly reasonable.
Just moving on to the effect of all this upon the life of the church. I mean, one thing you can't avoid is the effect on the finances of the church.
Yeah.
And obviously, there's a lot of people, you know, hurting financially, but nonetheless, you know, the church as a community does need money in order to pay for basic things, including the pay for priests. So what's the situation currently?
Situation, I suppose, let me put it this way, the church employees, like my lay staff, obviously have the same entitlement to support for their salaries as employees in any other sector. But the church itself doesn't get any of the supports that apply to businesses that are closed down, because those supports don't apply to a charity. Yet we obviously have lost our income stream substantially. Now, I have to say that many people have been very generous in that, you know, you get people actually on their way out to do their shopping, or during their you know, their visit to the parish church, are dropping their envelopes into the door of the parochial house. Some of them are doing the online donations, although that's not as kind of popular with an older age group, I suppose, as it would be with a younger age group. So we reckon that we probably lost about 40% of our usual income in the 12-month period. It's a big hit. Now, there would have been obviously some reductions in costs, but we still have to insure buildings. We still have to keep a modicum of heat in them in order to maintain them, and all the usual costs. As you say, the support of the clergy themselves, it depends on the contributions of the faithful, which are normally given at Mass. And again, I have to say that in our own diocese here, people have been very good But nonetheless, obviously the level of income, certainly has dropped. Probably not as much in the support for the clergy as it did in the support for the parish,
Right.
as I suppose there's a humanity there that people see.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of how many people are currently tuning in online to Mass, particularly on Sunday?
I think there are huge numbers. I actually, strangely enough, I celebrated a Mass just during the week for the students who are graduating in St. Andrew's College, our third level college. They do education and nursing and so on. And much to my surprise, because it wasn't a scheduled public Mass or it's a special thing, but there were 1,100 separate connections from. Which I mean, normally we would have a graduation Mass, and the numbers of people that would be coming into the church would be significantly less than that. So there is a sense in which people are tuning in, but I suppose the question to some extent would be, what is the quality of the tuning in? I saw a cartoon some time ago of a lady arriving into the church with a cigarette in one hand and a mug of tea in the other hand, and her hair in curlers, and the little kind of bubble coming out of it was saying, "Oh, I forgot that this one wasn't online."
Well, I saw a survey, doctors taking part in kind of Zoom courses, because to brush up on the skills. I think 59% were turning up in their pajamas.
Mind you, I can understand that when you consider that half of them are working nights.
Yeah.
I know my own sister who's nursing, has often had to go to meetings, although she's a night nurse 7 nights a week. She often, when she has to go to a meeting, it's in the day, and it's a bit of a pain.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, one of the things that I think all of this has shown up to some extent is, as a Catholic population, one of the things that we have lost to some extent over the past, and I say the last 50 years, I suppose, is many of the old traditional, what you might call popular devotions, the things that people did themselves. Classic example, obviously, the prayer, the rosary, or the Stations of the Cross, or whatever. So many of those have been sort of lost sight of. But people, we've become very dependent on the Eucharist. And I suppose, it goes without saying that the Eucharist is the source and summit of the life of the church, and it has to be central to who we are. But I suppose one of the things that the COVID-19 thing has thrown up a little bit is that that for many people, when they haven't got the Sunday Eucharist, they don't have anything else either. And one of the things I suppose that we've been trying to do, and our own diocese here in Elphin have been working closely with the Diocese of Clonfert on putting together spiritual resources for times like Lent and Christmastide, and for all the other liturgical seasons and so on, to help people to find ways of praying at home.
Sure.
One of the fascinating things just last week, as we had the idea of in relation to Ash Wednesday, how were we going to deal with this? We thought maybe we might even be open for Ash Wednesday, but we thought that the best thing to do was to make it possible for people to take ashes away with them. And in a sense, that's not a very modern idea, because in the old times, people often, came with a little envelope or a piece of tissue or whatever to take some ashes home to someone who was sick. So what we did was we blessed all the ashes, and we actually got, I have one of them here, we had a little sort of a sachet.
Come across that.
Bag, and they're only kind of 20 millimeters square, but I got thousands of those and distributed them around to the parishes. And so we had a little prayer card done, and it helped people to have a little service of prayer at home for the distribution of ashes in their own household. And there was a massive run on ashes, and what it says to me is that the people are certainly looking for spiritual expressions and spiritual resources to nourish them. And I think this is the point, going back to the original question about, what is thinking of government and effort. I suppose the point that I would be making to people is that that our people need to be nourished spiritually as well as physically. And while you mightn't notice as obviously the lack of spiritual nourishment as the lack of physical nourishment, gradually what happens is, obviously, if people cease to be nourished spiritually, if there isn't the prayer, and if there isn't the sacraments, and if there isn't the gathering as a faith community, then gradually a lot of the very practical things that Christians do in our society, which are inspired by their faith, will also begin to disappear.
Just looking ahead to post-pandemic and the state the church might be in, so I'm leaving aside the financial aspect here. Iona Institute commissioned an Amorach poll there a few months ago, and we asked people when it's all over, and this was a section of the people who were coming to Mass every week before the pandemic, and will you come back, on a weekly basis after the pandemic? So 4% said they would not, but 20% said they don't know if they'll come back after all this is over. So what would you predict will happen?
It's hard to predict. I mean, could I say that back in January of last year, which is 2 months before the pandemic, I had published a pastoral message, a reflection, I suppose, with the title "Some Definite Service," which is a quote from the words of John Henry Newman. And I suppose the idea that each one of us is called to some definite service. And I was wanting to ask people in all our parishes to consider, how they could be communities of mission rather than just service stations. And I suppose the challenge for us, I think, very much after COVID-19, while obviously hoping that we will be able to continue to provide, services of religious worship for our parishioners as we have done in the past, but that actually I think it's going to be more necessary than ever that our parishes are places where disciples are formed, where the community of the parish, as well as the family, is engaged in actually helping people to be disciples.
Why do you think? But sorry, go on.
No, it's just it's just that I suppose that a disciple, and that Pope Francis used the term missionary disciple. So that it's about it's very much about our responsibilities for one another in the community of the church, rather than thinking, the famous John F. Kennedy thing: ask not what your country could do for you, but what you could do for your country. And I think it's kind of the same thing. People sometimes think of the church in terms of what the church might be able to do for them.
I noticed. Sorry, go on.
No, it's just about the other. It's a two-way street. That's all I was going to say.
I noticed that, like in Britain, I think in England, in October, they stopped public worship again for a fairly short time, and many of the major religious leaders from across the board, like Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, etc., all signed a big long letter to Boris Johnson saying there's no justification for this. There's been no similar initiative here. Also, the French bishops took a joint letter from all the religious leaders to the government.
Well, I mean, I suppose I can look at it from a different perspective. But say here in Sligo, we have churches together in Sligo, and we sent a joint letter into the Taoiseach back in October. More recently, obviously, there have been engagements of the church leaders of all the different religious denominations, both together and separately with government. So this is going on. I suppose maybe we haven't perhaps been perceived to be jumping up and down in public, but that's not to say that things haven't been being done. The four archbishops had a meeting with the Taoiseach last week, and as I say, on Ash Wednesday, I wrote to all the politicians who represent our constituencies here, and we're effectively saying the same thing. I suppose the urgency of gathering may be slightly different for different religious traditions as well. I suppose within the Catholic tradition, we probably place more emphasis on, the regular Sunday participation. In some traditions, that wouldn't be quite such a strong emphasis.
Well, in Germany, there was a case taken to court to demand a return to public worship by a group of Muslims, and of course theirs is not a sacramental religion. In France, there was a Catholic lay group, I think, initially took the government to court last May and won. And then more recently, the French hierarchy took the government to court when they introduced temporary lockdown again. They lost that one, yes, but then it was lifted about 2 weeks later anyway. They say the reason the second one lost is because the whole of society was in lockdown, whereas previously in May they were lifting bits and pieces, but not the churches, so it seemed unfair. But in America, there have been a number of bishops in different states have taken their state governments to court, and I think they've won all of them. I think there was a victory in New York, a victory in California. So, I know Declan Ganley, the businessman, is taking the government to court over the same thing here. But I'm just wondering, why haven't the bishops thought of doing something similar?
Well, I don't suppose the church should be equated to the bishops necessarily. I think it is, it is interesting that Declan Ganley, as you say, has that case before the courts. It's taken an incredibly long time to progress through the courts, given the urgency of the situation. I suppose the bishops have chosen a diplomatic approach rather than a confrontational approach. And in fairness, I suppose I would have to say that, in the first wave, when we weren't scheduled to be back until the 20th of July, we actually got back on the 29th of June. In the second wave, when we came to the end of November, even though we weren't moving into level 2, we did have the facility to reopen and have public worship for the month of December. So I feel that was the result of.
We're still in a pretty poor state though, because unless the court intervenes, we'd be lucky to be back by Easter. It could be May, it could be June. If it goes on that long, it will mean that for like 8 or 9 months out of the last 12, we won't have been allowed to go to Mass. And I think we, again, are completely alone in Europe and been so completely drastic. And maybe it's because the bishops, and not just the bishops, but just church leaders in general in Ireland, have been too diplomatic, possibly.
Or perhaps because there hasn't been sufficient of a public swell of support for a return to worship. The interesting thing about it, I suppose, is we open for public worship at in Advent and for Christmas, and while we had put in place preparations for large crowds for Christmas, so that, say, here in the Cathedral Parish, we had additional masses in the cathedral, but we had also provided for overflow space in what's a fairly substantial parish hall across the road. In fact, we didn't need that overflow because actually people didn't come in such large numbers.
Yeah, well, obviously, I mean, people are still, being
Yeah.
cautious, particularly as it's older people would
Sure,
mainly
no,
come to mass. But on the other hand, I mean, at my local church, like like about as many came back as it was possible for the churches to accommodate in each of the masses. So, it was still like it was good to see that. And of course, as we've been discussing, it was all done so safely. And they can't really trace any outbreaks back to churches, I think, with one exception that I think was not a Catholic church. They wouldn't say which one it was. And all people can point to worldwide is isolated examples of individual churches not kind of obeying the safety rules, but they can't come up with a proportionate reason for it.
I suppose that bothers me a little bit is that sometimes in the reports that come from the public health authorities, there's reference, to the outbreaks associated with funerals or confirmations or whatever. When you go and examine it closely, what they're actually talking about is the outbreaks being associated with what happens afterwards. And of course, the assumption is that if you want to prevent people from gathering socially, say after a confirmation or after a funeral, you also have to ban their participation in the liturgical event. And I don't think the two things necessarily follow. We find that by and large, families and funeral directors and priests work very well together to manage the limitations that are imposed in relation to funerals. As I say, I think they're particularly draconian, and I think they definitely need to be reduced, so that the participation can be greater. But what does happen occasionally, unfortunately, is you get somewhere around the country, some particular family or some particular village or some particular funeral director throws caution to the winds, and a big outbreak happens, and of course then everybody gets blamed. So one of the things that I was saying recently, was that, and I believe this absolutely, that if people are not being responsible about the restrictions, they're actually delaying the return to any kind of normality for everybody else, And one of the things that I do feel, when our people are being, deprived of their freedom to participate in the Mass and the sacraments, you have to ask yourself, why is it possible in the last month for 2,500 people to fly into Ireland from countries that are on the red list, and that doesn't seem, that their freedom doesn't seem to be restricted in the same way. So I think it is very important that there would be that there is fair play. And I think particularly at the moment when we're moving into the second year of this, that people have to be able to perceive that there is fairness.